Hello, good folks. Welcome to my Netlogo tutorial where we'll be discussing importing and exporting of data using the turtles or agents. I'm going to start off with a little bit of an explanation of the environment here and procedures, global variables, etc. If you're familiar enough with Netlogo and you want to skip to how do I deal with CSV files, how do I export the data and create files, then you could skip to the next part. Let's get started. So first of all, we have an agent-based modeling environment, which is this black rectangle here, and we've got a couple of agents. We also have some buttons, and you can click on the interface here, create sliders, choosers, plots, etc. You could also create global variables here. So for instance, I used a switch to create a Boolean global variable. A couple of things that we're going to need to know to get to the next part is how to work with lists and string concatenation. So I created this quick demo and then we'll move on. Let's say I want to combine two strings, such as line 17. I want to combine A is equal to with the string B. Well, I can use the word procedure here to do that. So if I hit demonstrate, which runs this procedure to demonstrate, followed by an N, it's going to run everything within that procedure. We're going to get a few different outputs here. Let's run through it. So first it combined A is equal to B, right? These two strings. If I was missing this space and I ran it, you'd see that space isn't there, so I'm going to add that little space. And you could do multiple strings, so this has 3 different ones I separated with a comma. Okay. So that's using word for concatenation. Next, let's say we have an empty list, I. And this is a local variable. I'm using the let command here. Let I be equal to an empty list. The first print is going to say I is equal to, and we can see we're using that concatenation here with a variable now. I is equal to, and it's going to give us an empty list. Then we're going to use the lput procedure to say I want to take this string and put it into the list I. And lput puts it as the last item. Fput puts it as the first item. Because this will be the only item, it'll just show us A. Then the third print line is going to have B as the last item. So let's run that real quick. Okay, we can see I is equal to empty list, and then it's equal to a list that contains A as item 0, and then a list where item 0 is A and item 1 is B. So in Netlogo, much like many programming languages, in a list, the first item is not item 1, but item 0, and that's important for later on. All right, let's move on to our setup procedure. If you're familiar with Netlogo, you've used it a lot. There's usually a go procedure, right? We set something up, create an initial state for our world, and then we want the agents to interact with the world. So we hit go, and we'll make it a forever button, so it just loops until we give it some statement to end, or we manually press go again. Well, for this project, we really don't need the go statement. The first procedure within the setup procedure that we're going to look at is directories of files. Now we're digging into it. So you could put procedures in a procedure. So I press setup. First it's going to clear all, and then it's going to run directories of files. So what is that? what we're doing is first getting the parent directory. Where are we on the computer? And in the bottom right, we can see I have this window open here that has my Netlogo project, which is our current directory, and two other folders. If I want to access these further, it'd be helpful to know what is the current directory. So this part, this if-else statement, isn't necessary. If you're working on a local project, you don't plan on sharing it with anybody, you could just set it to some path that you set. You could also use the user directory to get there. But let's say you want to send this to somebody. Well, you're not going to hard code in the user path here. You're going to ask them to do it. So if I set new user to on, right, new user equals true, I hit setup, I'm going to get the first line, the user message, select the folder tutorial. When I press OK, now it's running the second line in the if then command. For some reason I have to back out one and then click on tutorial. Okay, that selected our tutorial folder for us. And we could see in the print statement in the command center, here's the path, file path. And we're going to set parent directory equal to that. Okay, now we know where we are on the computer, or Netlogo knows. So we want to now move into some of these folders to one, access the data that already exists, and then also to create or to tell Netlogo where we're going to send the exported data. So first, we're going to create some global variable called data input. And now we're using that CSV extension, which allows us to read in data from CSV files into a form like a list. And now we can use some of the Netlogo procedures and syntax to work with the list and then export it back to a CSV file. So we're going to set the data input using this procedure. And see how I'm grabbing the file name? I'm going to use that parent directory variable followed by the folder name. If I click in that folder, then the data file name. And I'm using that word procedure to concatenate the two. And again, you can see, while I'm printing the output variable, for the export data, I do a very similar method. And here we can see how it prints. Okay. So now we have values for data input, parent directory, and where we're going to export the data. Let's go further down the setup procedure. So Netlogo is run this procedure, and now we're just going to create some turtles. And the reason we're doing that is because we're going to use the turtles to work with the data. We have 3 rows of data, so we'll create 3 turtles, and there's a way you kind of will figure out once we get further in how I could have written this to make it so that I don't have to know the number of rows. I can use a length statement, but we don't have to worry about that right now, or columns in it. Okay, so we're just going to create some turtles. These are some pretty straightforward codes here. Put the turtles in a random position in the environment. We're going to set the size and the shape of the circles. That's fine. Okay, now we're moving on to the last part of the tutorial, which is, okay, we know where everything is, or Netlogo knows where everything is. It knows where the data files are, it knows where it's going to send the data, but how do we get it to do that, right? We've read in the data input, and I've used a monitor in the interface to report the data input so that when we first hit setup, we can make sure that we're getting the data that we see in our Excel sheet down here on the left. All right, let's create a local variable called data files. that uses the export directory followed by a slash like you would see normally in a path, followed by the who, followed by the data file type. Who reports the ID number of each turtle. So if I select that turtle, we can see it's turtle 2. So the who for this turtle is 2. For this one, it's 0. And for this turtle, it's 1. And you cannot undo that who number. Until you hit setup and it clears all, these turtles keep that number. What we're doing is creating files unique to the turtle. And you do not have to do this. This is something that I need for another project, so I figured I would use a similar method here. So if the data files don't currently exist in the exported data folder, then we're going to use file open to create that file name, which will look something like, imagine the full path here, slash for turtle 0 will be 0 dot CSV. For turtle 1, it'll do this. For turtle 2, it'll look like this. Okay. So we're going to use file open to create the blank CSV file for each turtle. And then I have another procedure here, get data. Let's go to our get data procedure. We're going to do two different types of data gathering here. One, where we're going to use each row as the values for the variables, and one we're going to use each column. Row is a little bit easier given the way that the CSV extension imports our data. We have this list of lists, and you have to do a little bit of a mental transformation here. We're used to looking at a matrix, and there's actually an extension where you can use matrices. I believe it's the table extension. But anyway, so we're used to seeing this in a sort of a matrix format with rows and columns, but now all of a sudden this looks very linear if you look at the data input list monitor. What happened? Well, we got a list of lists. So you'll notice that var1, var2, var3 is a list, right? It's surrounded by brackets, followed by 3 more lists that contain the row data. Each row has its own list. And all of that is wrapped in other brackets, another set of brackets, making it a list of lists. How do we get through that? Well, first I want to create an empty list called variable list. And that's going to be occupied by the items that we need, or the specific values to import into the var1, var2, var3 here. So we're going to first create that empty list, and then we're going to set that list equal to item followed by an item number followed by the list. So we're looking at the data input list, and what I did was put the who number plus 1. For turtle 0, the who number is 0. But item 0 in our list of lists is the variable headers. That's not the information we want. We want, in this case, the second item, which is item 1. So we're going to do plus 1. So we can see here, who 0, or just 0 plus 1, is going to give us item 1. When the second turtle 1 does this method, they'll then get item 2, and then item 3, and so on. So now that we have this list, we're going to use the same method, right? Set variable 1 equal to item 0 in the variable list. And this is actually adding an unnecessary step, but it works better in the next method. So I kind of just wanted to demonstrate how it's helpful to first set up this empty list. So let's inspect one of these turtles. If we look at the turtle's properties, we see the variable list is a list of 3 items, 0, 7, and 1. And if we look down here at this third row, we get the values 0, 7, and 1. And then we're going to take the first item and set it in the first variable, and so on, second and third. Okay, but what if you need to go through and make it so that each agent's variable values are along the column rather than the row? Now we need to do some loops and we need to do some iterators, but it's actually kind of straightforward once you get an idea of what does it mean to iterate through a list. And how do we do that within a loop? All right, let's start off same as the last one. We're going to create an empty list. And now we're going to create an iterator. So look at this note here. Create an iterator I. And do you see the format of this list is very similar to our data input list, right? We have 1, 2, 3 items inside of a list. And those items are themselves a list. So this first one, because it's an item, even though it's a list, it's still an item, here I would equal 0 if I chose that the value of I starts at 0. And if I say later on in the loop, every time you go through the loop, add 1 to I, then the next time it goes through the loop, I is going to equal 1. And then the next time, I is going to equal 2. And now every time I loop through this larger list, I go from item 0 to item 1 to item 2. Excellent. Because we want to skip the first item in our larger list, because it's just the variable headers, I'm going to start with item, or I equals 1, which is the second item in the list. Great. Now we need to know how many times to loop through the list so that we don't go and shorten one of the agents and all of a sudden they have less values and it doesn't go beyond the maximum number of items in the list and we get an error message. The length procedure is going to tell us how many items are in a list. We're going to subtract 1 because we're ignoring or skipping over the header, the variable headers, which is the first item. And if we print this statement, we should get a value of 3. We can see down here in the bottom left of the command center that we do indeed get the value of 3. Right? We have 3 columns, 3 rows. And we're going to use the repeat command to initiate our loop. And this is the number of times we want to repeat it. And then again, everything inside of the brackets are the commands that we're going to run. So we're going to iterate through the data item list in a way where we want to, for turtle 0, grab item 0 in each list. If you look at the comment note here that I've highlighted, I've recreated what the list kind of looks like. Right, this is the variable headers, bar headers. We're ignoring that one. We're skipping where I equals 1. which is this first list, and we want to input in our variable list 2 for turtle 0, item 0, and then item 0 in the next list, item 0 in the next list. For turtle 1, we want the second in each list. And we want to take those and input them into our variable list 2. And that's what this line of code does. Whenever you're using the output procedure, you're going to set your list, everything that you want to include, and then end with that list name again. So we're going to set variable list 2 to first output item who, right? Turtle 0 is running this line, running this procedure, so it's going to be item 0 of item I, which in the first loop I is equal to 1, so item 1 in the data input list. And then after it's inputted one value, right? We ran through this, but we didn't finish the loop yet. It's only input one value. Then we're going to set I equal to I plus 1, which is doing this incrementation for the iterator here. And now when it repeats the second time, the turtle's going to grab their corresponding value in the next list. And then it'll do it a third time, but it won't continue because we already told Netlogo how many times to repeat it. After the third one, we are now, I is equal to the length of the data input minus 1, which is 3. So let's see how that works out. We could see that turtle 2, which should be the third column in his third column, has the values 5, 2, and 1. So down here we see that is the values, those are the values in the third column. We could also look at the data input list and see that the item 2 in our first list that we iterated over, the value is 5. We grab the 5. In the next list, the value is 2. We grab the 2, and so on. And then we did the same thing as in the first method where we just grab the rows, and we're going to set variable 1 equal to item 0 in the variable list. So we have 5 here, and it's item 0. Then grab item 1, and put that as the value for v2, variable 2. And same thing with the last. And the last thing that this procedure does is export our values. So we may use the values to have the agents increase or decrease over time, or to signify whether they should interact with one another, etc. But we also might want to export these initial states that we've created, because if they are going to interact later, maybe the values change. So what were those initial states? You're not going to write them down by hand or try to remember them. You could export it to a data file or a CSV file by using file print, followed by the list. If we go to export data, we can see that each turtle has their corresponding data file that contains variable list and variable list 2. And you can get creative and mess around with how you want to export all of the data. You can use that word procedure to concatenate multiple strings and lists and other variables together. And finally, I'm going to close the files. This could prevent some error messages later on. Um, it's always a good idea to close out your files after you open them. And also take note that all of the get data procedure was taking place inside of the ask turtles command. So each turtle was running that get data procedure and iterating through that list. And that's how we were able to create files that were unique to the turtle who ID. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this was educational, and feel free to comment ways to import and export data differently. There's tons of methods. This is just one method that I'm currently using for a larger project. Thank you for watching.